The air in the master bedroom of the Abernathy mansion wasn't breathable, but rather suspended, a volatile mixture of hospital disinfectant, the expensive and useless perfume of Silas's wife, and the faint metallic smell of blood that with each passing hour seemed to be decomposing within the farmer's veins. The sound was dictated by a machine, the rhythmic, almost obscene hiss of the pulmonary ventilator pushing and pulling oxygen into Silas Abernathy's dying lungs. It was the sound of expensive technology, imported directly from Boston, fighting a losing war against something that doctors, with all their knowledge and diplomas hanging in distant offices, couldn't even name. Silas Abernathy, the undisputed owner of 40,000 acres of pine forests and open fields in the cold heart of Havenwood, Maine, the man whose word was worth more than the seal of any town clerk, was drowning in dry land. He was not a man given to weakness. He had built his empire not only with financial acumen, but with a stoic ruthlessness that defined the county landscape. He bought, sold, and crushed the competition with the same indifference with which he pruned a diseased tree. Now, however, his robust body, which had never bent to anyone, was humiliatingly surrendering to an invisible and swift enemy. What you've heard so far is just the tip of the iceberg of what really happened to Silas. You'll still discover how the healer's interference altered the course of his life. But before we continue, like the video and subscribe to the channel to support this type of content. You give us the strength to bring you more and more exciting stories like Silas's. The room, hastily adapted to serve as a private intensive care unit, seemed a protest against the nature of the disease. Dark oak paneling, Persian tapestries, and the dim light of a crystal chandelier attempted to impose dignity on a scene of biological decay. In the center, surrounded by cables and monitors displaying increasingly faint lifelines, lay Silas, a dethroned king reduced to a pale, feverish mass. His skin, once tanned by sun and labor, was now strangely marbled, with purplish spots spreading like ink on parchment. The Boston doctors had arrived arrogantly and left with cautious apologies. Dr. Albright, a renowned cardiologist, had retreated just 2 hours earlier, his eyes filled with professional frustration, not compassion. Mrs. Abernathy, he had told his devastated wife Alice, while bending his stethoscope with clinical precision, I simply have no more interventions to offer. Whatever is attacking Mr. Abernathy is a systemic failure that destroys cells and tissues faster than we can treat them. His blood markers are chaotic. It's a matter of time, hours perhaps. I ask that you call the priest. This death sentence, pronounced in the monotonous and sterile tone of modern science, hung over the mansion like the thick fog that rolled in from the pine forests to embrace the property. Silas's millions, which had promised protection against all the world's hardships, had miserably failed to protect him from his own mortality. Money could buy the latest ventilator, the most discreet nursing staff, and the most expensive diagnosis, but it could not buy a cure for the inexplicable. It was a cruel paradox. The man who possessed almost everything now possessed only the time he had left. The main conflict erupted in the adjacent living room, far from the tubes and the hiss of oxygen. The eldest son, Thomas, a businessman as pragmatic and inflexible as his father, was arguing vehemently with his daughter-in-law, Sarah, who had a more sensitive temperament and a disturbing inclination towards irrational hope. What do you suggest, Sarah? That we start burning incense and summoning spirits? Thomas's voice was low and tense, heavy with despair, but veiled by the decorum demanded by the Abernathy name. Dr. Albright said it's terminal. It's time to accept it and arrange the funeral. Sarah, whose eyes were red from sleepless nights and observing suffering, clutched a rosary that, ironically, she had received from an old Havenwood resident whom Silas had always despised. But what about the stories, Thomas? You know what they say about what happens when science fails in this area. This was the dividing line, the point of tension that Silas Abernathy had worked his entire life to deny, the existence of something that escaped the balance sheet and the scalpel. Havenwood was a town with deep roots, planted centuries ago by settlers who brought with them ancient legends of the old world, legends that flourished in the shadows of Maine's vast forests. Despite the modern facade and Silas's wealth, the entire town still murmured about the old magic, and more specifically, about Elara Vance. Elara Vance, The name, when spoken aloud in Abernathy manner, was like a crack in the ice. She was the healer, the folk healer, the woman of the woods, as Silas had scornfully called her in life, or in the most derogatory version, the Witch of Havenwood. Ilara lived in seclusion on the edge of the Abernathy estate, in a cabin that smelled of damp earth, sage smoke, and crushed roots. She didn't accept money for her services, but rather exchanges of favors, or more enigmatically, whatever the heart can give. Her reputation was twofold. Some swore she had cured a child's persistent cough or solved years of infertility. Others saw her as a dangerous charlatan, exploiting the credulity of the simple-minded. The loop was now evident. The most skeptical and powerful man in the region was at the mercy of a force he had spent his life ridiculing. Tensions escalated. Thomas and Alice, clinging to decency and status, vehemently rejected the idea. But the family lawyer, Mr. Thompson, a man more practical than spiritual, watched the dwindling vital signs on the monitor with growing dread. He wasn't concerned about Silas's soul, but about the will and the impending legal battle over the vast estate. "Excuse me," Thompson interjected, his voice a nervous growl. "With all due respect to the medical diagnosis, Silas gave us no specific instructions regarding a situation like this. We don't have a time frame of days. We have perhaps 12 hours. If there's some local legend, some superstition, anything that might delay the inevitable, why don't we try? It costs nothing but our dignity, and I believe we've already lost it seeing his condition." The word dignity was the trigger. The weight of the impending loss was suffocating. Silas's refusal to simply die quickly was causing logistical and emotional chaos. It was Mrs. Perkins, the old housekeeper who had served the Abernathy family for 30 years, who took the decisive step. She was the personification of old Havenwood, quiet, observant, and possessing a knowledge that did not come from books. She entered the living room, ignoring Thomas's shocked stares, and went straight to Alice, his wife. "Madam," she said, her voice hoarse with restrained emotion, "Silas, he has a cold fever. It's not natural. Medicine can't touch it because it's not a common illness. I remember years ago when swamp fever struck young Timmy Carter. Everyone thought he would die. The doctor couldn't do anything. It was Ilara who made the nettle infusion and the clay poultices. Timmy is alive today, building barns in East Havenwood." She looked into Alice's eyes, pleading not for faith but for practical desperation. "You know Silas couldn't stand her, madam, but he's on the brink of the abyss. We don't do this out of belief, but because we've exhausted rationality. It's time to consider madness." Mrs. Perkins' argument, grounded in local reality, acted as a disruptive pattern in the spiral of denial. Alice, clinging to the status quo, shook her head weakly. "I don't know, Perkins. What if she's dangerous?" "Dangerous for whom, madam? For his bank account. He's dying." The housekeeper, for the first time in decades, raised her voice, cutting through the pretentious atmosphere of the room. A tense silence settled in, broken only by the insistent whistling of the ventilator. Alice's gaze wandered to the corridor, where a nurse was gesturing frantically, indicating a new and terrible drop in Silas's vital signs. The decision could no longer be postponed. "Thompson," Alice said, her voice as thin as paper. "Go, find that woman, tell her that Mr. Abernathy needs her. Tell her she'll have whatever she wants." The lawyer, relieved to have something to do, hurriedly grabbed his overcoat and car keys, but Mrs. Perkins stopped him with a firm hand on his shoulder. "You're not going by car, Thompson. You're going on foot, and alone. She doesn't like engines or being in a hurry, and you need to bring an offering. Something from the land that Silas stole. An apple from one of the old apple trees he cut down 20 years ago." Thompson looked at the housekeeper as if she had gone mad, but the urgency of the situation and Mrs. Perkins' unexpected authority were undeniable. He picked a bruised apple from an old fruit bowl and stepped out into the cold, damp Maine night, toward the dense forest that marked the border between the world of wealth and the world of shadows. Thompson's journey was a stark contrast to the lawyer's regimented life. He crossed fields that belonged to Silas, but which seemed to resist his control, battling low branches and sticky mud. The smell of the forest, of rotting earth and pine needles, was overwhelming. After 15 minutes, the sound of Silas's machines faded, replaced only by the rustling of leaves and the wind howling through the trees. He found Ilara Vance's cabin not by map, but by a trail, the unmistakable scent of peat smoke mixed with something sweet, almost minty. The cabin was small, dimly lit by an oil lamp, and seemed to have grown from the ground, covered in moss and ivy. There was no fence, but the feeling that he had crossed an invisible boundary was palpable. Thompson banged on the crudely made wooden door, feeling pathetic and desperate. The door opened slowly, silently. Ilara Vance was there. She wasn't old, but she was timeless. Her hair was a mixture of grey and black, braided with small pieces of wood and feathers. Her eyes, a clear, penetrating blue, fixed on Thompson, not with surprise, but with a kind of weary resignation. She wore layers of coarse woolen fabric and emanated a warmth that contrasted with the coldness of the night air. "Silas Abernathy is dying," she said, her voice a deep whisper, before Thompson could even speak. It was the great revelation of the night. She already knew. The mystery surrounding his existence seemed justified at that moment. "Yes, Mrs. Vance, we're begging. Science has failed. The doctors said there's no hope. He needs you." Thompson held out the apple, feeling ridiculous. "This is an offer." Ilara didn't immediately take the apple. Her eyes scanned Thompson, assessing not his wealth, but his soul. "Silas has always hated what I stand for, Mr. Thompson. He built his fortune by denying the interconnectedness of things, defiling the earth with the efficiency of his greed. He has mocked me publicly. Why should I waste my energy on a man who has spent his life mocking me? Because he'll pay, with anything, whatever you want." "Millions," Thompson promised desperately. Ilara finally picked up the apple, examining it. She smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a warning. "Money, Mr. Thompson, is useless against what is consuming your boss. What he has is not a bacterial or viral disease. It is a disease of the soul. He has broken the balance. To reverse the course, he will have to pay with what he values most, and that is not gold." She threw the apple on the ground. "Tell him I'll come, but he needs to call me by name, and the payment will be mine, chosen by me. If he accepts my conditions and survives my cure, he will be indebted to me in a way that his money cannot repay." The lawyer swallowed hard. "And what is the payment, Ms. Vance?" "I will not choose him until the work is done. But I know that if death takes him, it will do so quickly. He is on the threshold now. We don't have much time." "Go," she ordered, already grabbing her old leather bag and beginning to fill jars with liquids and dried roots. The healer was preparing to confront the scourge of the most powerful man in Havenwood with the only currency he had never considered: obligation. Thompson ran back to the mansion, his heart pounding, feeling as if he had just sold Silas Abernathy's soul to save his own life. Time was running out quickly, and the strange woman from the forest, now heading towards the mansion, promised a ransom that would come at a higher and more mysterious cost than anything they could imagine. The next hour would decide not only whether Silas Abernathy would live, but how he would live, and under whose yoke. The clock was ticking for the millionaire farmer, and the only hope lay in the hurried steps of Ilara Vance, who carried with her not the sterility of science, but the raw, undeniable power of nature and the mysticism of Havenwood. The suspense was only beginning. An inner fire licked at the edges of his consciousness, turning reality into a damp grey blur. Hilarius Thorne, the owner of half the arable land in Wiltshire, the man who had always measured his success in tons of barley and heads of pedigree cattle, now measured his life in seconds of bearable pain. The fever was a relentless tyrant, and though the main chamber of Thorne Manor, with its high ceilings and windows protected from the eternal cold of the English plains, was in theory a sanctuary, for Elias it had become his warm tomb. The Egyptian linen sheets, which had once symbolized the pinnacle of comfort, now seemed like rough, damp strips that bound him to prostration. Despair hadn't arrived like a sudden wave, but like the slow, inexorable sinking of an iron ship. He had trusted the best doctors in London, men in impeccable white coats and academic jargon, who had offered him complex diagnoses and exorbitantly expensive treatments, all failing to identify the cause or halt the disease's progression. The reports piled on the ebonized table in the anteroom were monuments to modern incompetence, indecipherable graphs, pompous Latin terms, and, in the end, the silent and terrible conclusion: we are lost. Elias, the staunch skeptic, the rationalist who despised anything that couldn't be placed under a microscope or converted into profit, now clung to the thin, almost invisible shadow of hope that his desperate employees had invoked. Ilara, the healer. The mansion smelled of expensive antiseptics mixed with the odors of disease and cold sweat. But as time passed, a new scent began to seep through the ancient stone walls: damp earth, peat smoke, and an intensely bitter herbal fragrance, as if a piece of the forbidden forest had been brought inside. Ilara's arrival wasn't heralded by doorbells or gleaming vehicles, but by an unexpected silence that fell over the frenetic activity of the servants. Elias, amidst the delirium, could feel the change in the atmosphere. The noises of the house, the creaking of the stairs, the hurried whisper of the housekeeper ceased, replaced by a reverent, almost fearful quiet. Oakhaven was a place where modernity attempted to impose itself on centuries of folklore, and Ilara was a living, austere reminder that folklore had roots deeper than any concrete foundation. She entered the room not through the doctor's entrance, but through the side door that led to the garden, as if she had followed an invisible trail or deliberately ignored the etiquette of the estate. Her presence was immediately at odds with the room's decadent luxury. He wore neither linen nor silk, but thick, dark wool, stained with dry earth and dew. His hair, the color of damp ash, was braided in a practical manner, and his eyes, the color of the deep waters of Loch Ness, swept the room with a calm authority that made Elias's personal physician seem like a frightened boy. "Mr. Thorne." Her voice was deep and melodic, laden with an old, almost forgotten regional accent. There was no pity in it, only assessment. She didn't ask how he felt. It seemed she already knew the answer before he even thought of it. Elias tried to answer, but his throat was dry and hoarse, and the sound that came out was a miserable groan, unworthy of a man who negotiated millions. He could only move his hand in a weak gesture of resignation. His brain, however, was still active, fighting against the fog. "She's a charlatan, a deceiver. Look at her with those ridiculous clothes and that aura of cheap mysticism. But she's my only chance." What a humiliation! Ilara approached the bed and, without asking permission, pulled back the heavy sheet. Her hands weren't as soft as those of private nurses, but they possessed a restrained strength and a familiarity with physical labor that Elias vaguely recognized, the precision of someone who deals daily with life and death on earth. She placed her palm on Elias's forehead, and it was as if the fire consuming him had found a counterpoint of ice. The sharp pain in his head pulsed against the coldness of her skin. "My blood is heavy. My air is blocked," she murmured, not to him, but to herself, or to something invisible in the corner of the room. Elias's internal conflict was monumental. His mind screamed at him to expel her, to call the hospital and demand morphine to silence the hell within his body. But his body, treacherous and weak, was quiet, waiting. He noticed the bag she had brought, made of worn dark leather, tied with a natural fiber cord. It contained no stethoscopes, disposable needles, or sterile vials. When she opened it, the smell of earth and moss intensified. The first thing Ilara did was demand that all the electric lights be turned off and the thick crimson velvet curtains be drawn. The room plunged into a soft twilight, illuminated only by a kerosene lantern she lit, whose flickering orange flame cast long, dancing shadows, distorting the Victorian furniture into monstrous shapes. Next, she went to the fireplace, which was cold and clean, ready for the coming season. She didn't light it with kindling or gas, but took from her bag a block of pressed peat and a handful of dry leaves of an indefinable, almost black color. In a few moments, the room was filled with a dense, aromatic and pungent smoke that irritated Elias's lungs and, strangely, made the throbbing pain in his bones seem less sharp. The air wasn't just hot, it was heavy. Ilara's ritual was methodical and deeply unsettling to Elias's bourgeois sensibilities. She spoke in a low but steady voice, not in English. It was an ancient dialect, perhaps Welsh or Celtic, that resonated with the Stone Age in the hills of Oakhaven. They were not prayers, they were invocations. She began to mix the ingredients. On a small polished wooden board that looked as if it had been salvaged from a river, she crushed the herbs with a volcanic stone pestle, working with a concentration bordering on trance. Elias watched, fascinated and horrified, as the dark green of the leaves mingled with an earthy red powder and an oily black viscous substance that seemed to be wild beeswax. The smells battled each other, sweet and cloying, minty and bitter. "You need to drink," she said, extending a simple wooden cup, carved with symbols that Elias dared not identify. The potion inside was dark and murky, with floating sediment. It didn't look medicinal, it looked like liquefied clay. What is that?" Elias managed to whisper, his voice hoarse. Ilara didn't lose her temper, but her eyes fixed on him with a severity that made him feel childish. "It's the answer your body demanded when your mind refused to seek it. Drink, now." The fear of dying was finally overcoming the fear of being poisoned by a folk healer. Elias brought the cup to his lips. The taste was unbearable, a combination of soot, damp earth, wild pepper, and something floral that resembled detergent. His stomach immediately churned, but Ilara's strength was unexpectedly present. She gripped his shoulder with steely firmness, preventing him from moving until the last drop had gone down. The effect wasn't gradual, it was an internal aggression. Within seconds, Elias felt a wave of heat that was different from fever. It wasn't the sickly temperature consuming him, but a heat that came from within, rising from his stomach to his chest, as if he had swallowed embers. He began to sweat profusely, not the cold, viscous sweat of illness, but a warm, purifying sweat. His clothes, the mattress, everything was soaked in minutes. The pain escalated. If the fever had previously been a discordant orchestra, now it was a deafening trumpet solo. Every joint screamed, his head felt like it was going to explode, and he had a momentary, terrifying vision of vibrant colors and geometric shapes swirling around the kerosene lantern. It was the climax of the illness, stimulated, amplified by the healer's intervention. Elias tried to scream, but the pressure in his chest was so great that he could only gasp. He was right, after all. She was a charlatan, and he was dying because of his ultimate arrogance. He opened his eyes, blurred with pain, to face Ilara, expecting to see in her the panic or the wicked satisfaction of someone who had deceived a rich man. But Ilara was perfectly calm. She stood at the edge of the bed, her hands hovering over him, not touching him, but he felt the pressure of her energy, almost palpable, like the air before a storm. Her lips moved quickly, and this time he caught a few words from the ancient dialect that seemed to have something to do with deep roots and return to the earth. What followed was both extraordinary and repulsive. Elias felt a violent spasm in his stomach. Ilara, as if she had anticipated the event, grabbed a ceramic basin that was hidden on the floor. He vomited, but it wasn't just bile and the bitter broth of the potion. There was something else, something dark, thick, that smelled of metal and ancient decay. It was the grotesque materialization of the disease, expelled with unprecedented violence. When the spasm finally subsided, Elias was exhausted, trembling, but to his stunned confusion, the fever had receded. Not completely, but the fire had diminished to a manageable blaze. He was wet, dirty, nauseous, but for the first time in weeks, he could feel the weight of his own limbs. He was alive. Ilara brushed the repulsive pelvis aside with the tip of her foot, as if it were worthless trash, and began preparing for the second phase of his treatment. She didn't praise him, didn't console him, didn't even acknowledge him as a patient who had just experienced extreme trauma. Now she took a raw cotton handkerchief and soaked it in an oil that smelled of the forest after a heavy rain. She began to massage his feet and ankles with surprising force, rubbing the oil into his skin until it was hot and red. Elias, accustomed to the gentleness of modern therapeutic massages, was shocked by the efficient brutality of the technique. It was painful, but the pain was of a different kind, healthy, stimulating. While she was working, Ilara finally broke the silence to instruct him, her voice now softer but still authoritative. The disease doesn't reside only in the blood, Mr. Thorne. It resides in the land you deny and the air you hold. You built your kingdom with contempt, and contempt dried up your marrow. What I have given you now is the key to the door. It is bitter because life is bitter when it is wasted. He tried to argue, but she interrupted him with a piercing look. Don't try to understand with your head what only the body can feel. The poison has been expelled, but the emptiness remains. If you don't fill that void with strength, it will return. She revealed a few more items from her bag. 3 smooth, dark stones with veins of pale quartz that looked like tiny frozen streams. She carefully placed them on her chest, one over her heart, another over her solar plexus, and the last over what Elias recognized as her liver. The stones were cold, but soon absorbed and emitted a strange, deep heat, penetrating her skin and seeming to calm the inner area where the fire had previously manifested. Elias, the man who laughed at crystals and auras, now lay paralyzed, accepting the cold, mystical weight of these ancient rocks. He was at their mercy, and that was the most terrifying truth of all. Ilara stood up. The process had lasted perhaps an hour, but it felt like an entire night in purgatory. She gathered her tools and the remaining ingredients, cleaning the place quickly and efficiently. The fever will return tonight, she predicted with the same certainty a meteorologist uses to announce the tide. But it will be different. The body will react. Don't fight it, Mr. Thorne. Let it flow. It is heat that turns iron into steel, and disease that turns man to dust. Your choice is simple. Melt or harden. She didn't promise a cure. She didn't promise he would survive sunrise. She merely prepared him for the most brutal battle he had ever faced. She gave him a small muslin bag containing a handful of tiny dried seeds. Chew these every 3 hours, even if you don't feel hungry. They will bind to your body. I will return at sunrise if you have endured the night. With that, the healer from Oakhaven, the woman whom scientists would despise and older farmers feared, left the room as quietly as she had entered. The shadows of the kerosene lantern swayed on the wall. The scent of peat and herbal bitterness was now the only permanent tenant in Elias Thorne's room. He lay prostrate, but the mental fog had dissipated enough for reality to hit him with full force. He had vomited up the evil. He was caught in a primal ritual, and most importantly, he wasn't dead. He was trapped on the threshold of life, awaiting the return of the fever, fearing what the night would bring, but with the agonizing spark of recognition. Her knowledge was real, and he had surrendered to it. A lifetime of skepticism was being dismantled piece by piece, not by logic, but by the brute force of survival. The night would be long, and the millionaire farmer knew that if he survived, he would no longer be the same Elias Thorne. Waiting for dawn was waiting for his new sentence, decided not by doctors, but by the woman of the forest. The awakening didn't come with the sterile brightness of a hospital room or the rhythmic sound of electronic monitors, but rather with the deep dampness of the earth and an aroma of burnt forest mixed with the sweetness of molasses. Silas Croft opened his eyes, and for a lingering moment, the only thing he could process was the color. A dark green, almost black, of the rustic wooden ceiling, stained by time and the smoke of countless winters. Where was the unbearable buzzing of pain that had consumed him? Where was the excruciating pressure in his right side that had led him to hallucinate about debts and heirs? There was only a trace of pain, a distant pang, like the memory of a bruise, but not the monster that was tearing at his insides. He tried to move his arm, and surprisingly he did. The weight of the lethargy had lessened, not vanished completely, but receded to the edges of his body, like the ebbing tide. The change was so radical, so impossible, that his logical mind, the mind that had built an agricultural empire from nothing but cold calculation and aggressive skepticism, refused to accept the testimony of his own nerves. He lay on a low bed made of thick logs in the center of Ilara May's cabin, the woman the Red Creek community called the Healer, or in more fearful whispers, the Swamp Witch. The air was thick, almost chewy, laden with the fumes of crushed herbs, animal oils, and an ancient metallic smell that Silas vaguely associated with blood, but which seemed to be neutralized by some other bittersweet substance. A thick, warm layer of dark, dense paste covered his chest and abdomen. It wasn't a modern dressing. It was something organic, pulsing slightly with his body heat, and seemed to be pulling, sucking the disease out of him. Silas, the man who always demanded quantifiable explanations for every event in his life, felt like an embryo, naked and helpless, submerged in a process that defied all known laws of biology or medicine. The doctors in Lexington and Nashville, with their diplomas hanging in mahogany frames and their machines costing fortunes, had agreed that he had only days left. Organ failure was an established fact, an inevitable straight line on the graph of life. But here in the middle of nowhere, under the care of a recluse who used tree bark and roots as a pharmacy, that straight line seemed to have curved abruptly toward the horizon of continuity. The quiet of the cabin was punctuated only by the gentle crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft, almost aquatic sound of Ilara May working in a corner. She stood with her back to him, bent over an aged wooden table, grinding something in a volcanic stone mortar that looked as if it had been taken from an ancient museum. Her movements were slow, deliberate, full of an economy of effort that was almost ritualistic. She wore a thick dark linen apron, and her white hair, tangled like mangrove roots, was loosely tied back. She didn't seem to have slept. Her expression was one of unceasing concentration, as if she were keeping a force of nature under control by sheer willpower alone. Silas coughed, a dry, weak sound that seemed too loud in that reverent silence. Ilara May stopped the pestle immediately but did not turn around. "It's not time to speak yet, Silas Croft." Her voice was deep and rough, like stones rolling in a dry river. "Your body is in a state of limbo, not at peace. You have much to purge before you can waste energy on empty words." Silas wanted to argue. He wanted to demand to know what was in the folder, what was in his tea, which had the bitter, earthy taste of wildlife, the exact cost of the treatment. He wanted to put the transaction in business terms, something he could understand and crucially control. But the mere attempt to form the words in his throat brought a sudden, terrible tightness, a physical reminder of how close to the edge he still was. "What did you put in me?" he managed to whisper, his voice hoarse and pathetic, humiliating. Ilara May finally turned around. Her eyes were a pale, searching grey, and there was a depth to them that suggested she was reading not the man in the bed, but the story of all the land he had bought and sold, all the ruthless decisions that had brought him to the brink of death. "What's in you, Silas, is what was missing. Recognition," she said, walking slowly to the bed, carrying a small container of clay. "The paste is just the catalyst. It's the red clay you ignored in your fields, the fungus that grows only on the oldest oak wood, mixed with the sap of a root I dug up in the darkness under the new moon. Ingredients you trampled on for 50 years, considering them weeds or mere distractions from profit. They aren't expensive in currency, but they are prohibitively expensive in effort and respect." She knelt beside the bed, her proximity carrying the strong scent of smoke and pine. She began to gently remove the old paste, which was now dry and flaky, revealing skin beneath that, though pale, was no longer grey and cold. For the first time in months, Silas felt warmth radiating from his own core. "Your illness, Silas," Ilara May continued, preparing the new application, her voice low and didactic, "was not primarily a failure of the body, but an exhaustion of its foundation. You built a fortune, an empire of corn and soy, but you did so by sucking the soul from the earth, giving nothing in return but chemicals and greed. The body is a piece of the earth, Silas. If the earth is exhausted, the body also gives way." That was her philosophy, the foundation of her practical mysticism that the community feared and depended on. It wasn't religion, but sacred ecology. Silas, who had always ridiculed talk of sustainability as bohemian drivel, was momentarily speechless. "I gave you a physical antidote," she said, applying the new layer of paste which was cold and thick, causing an immediate shiver. "It's repairing the fissures, healing the internal bleeding that your doctors called inexplicable. But the most important antidote is not yet complete. I can only give you that when you are strong enough to carry it." Silas squinted. The fear had subsided, replaced by intense curiosity, and more dangerously by indignation at being reprimanded by a woman who lived outside the power grid. "I'll pay whatever it takes," he promised, desperately trying to regain familiarity with financial control. The land. What do you want? My 1,000 acres on the floodplain? You can have half, or whatever amount you want, 5 million, 10. Name your price. Ilara May laughed, a dry, humorless sound that echoed off the wooden planks. You still don't understand. You think of me as a seller of rare goods. I don't want your money, Silas. Your money is toxic. It comes from starving soil, and I don't want your land, not the land that has been plowed and poisoned by generations of monoculture. I want what you've forgotten you had. Silas frowned, trying to rummage through the drawers of his memory. What did he own that had no monetary value? There is a price, of course, she continued, looking at him seriously. A price that will cost you far more than money. You're on the verge of death because you were deeply out of balance with the cycle, and the cycle demands reparation. You can't simply return to the world of the living and continue draining life, not after having been saved by it. She stood up, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning sun now streamed through the cabin's single window, illuminating the dust particles suspended in the air and revealing the vast collection of jars, hanging dried herbs, and gnarled roots lining the walls. It was a pharmacy, a laboratory, and a sanctuary all in one. The first step in reparation is stillness. You will stay here without moving, drinking only what I give you. The second step is memory. You need to sift through the filth from which you came. Not the filth you cultivated, but the filth that formed you. What did you lose when you decided that only accumulation mattered? Stepping away to the fireplace to prepare more tea, Ilara May shifted her focus to the looming threat from the outside world, a point she knew would unsettle Silas's controlling instincts. Your children and your lawyers are in a frenzy, she announced casually, as if commenting on the weather. The richest man in the county disappeared from the hospital and was taken to the witch's lair. They don't understand that you're safe. They only see the loss of control. One of their trusted men, young Mr. Hartley, is just a mile from my property right now, trying to convince Sheriff Potts to issue a search and rescue warrant. They want to bring you back to civilization and connect you to machines that will confirm you should be dead. The name Hartley, his operations manager, brought a glimpse of the brutal reality he had left behind. If Silas were here, in a near-death state, what would be happening to the fall harvest? To the grain futures contracts? The idea of Hartley managing his empire without his oversight caused a sharper pang of anxiety than the remaining physical pain. Tell him to come back. Tell him I'm okay, Silas demanded, trying to stand up, but Ilara May stopped him with a look as strong as a rock. Did you try to tell them you were okay when you were in the hospitals? You have no voice outside these walls, Silas. Your fortune is your prison, and your status makes you a property to be fought over. If they find you, they'll take you, and if they do, the healing process will be brutally interrupted and you'll be back where you were. They'll try to force the cure through your flawed logic, and your body, now that it has accepted what I'm giving it, will violently reject the cold chemicals. She handed him the mug of steaming tea. The smell was of roots and smoke, but there was an underlying sweetness that was the first pleasant thing he had tasted in months. They can't just invade, Silas argued, breathing heavily, but more easily. I am a free man. Your freedom is suspended by your despair, Silas, she replied. The law is much more inclined to intervene on behalf of a sick and wealthy man accused of being the victim of a charlatan than to respect the choice of a dying man. They will come, with papers and uniforms. Your only defense now is to remain silent and accept what your body demands, the inversion. You need to give something back to the cycle before it accepts you back. It's not my magic that's saving you, Silas. It's your need to live directed towards the land you betrayed. The external threat served as the most powerful of pattern interrupts. The internal tension of the illness was replaced by the urgency of survival against his own world. He, Silas Croft, the man who ruled the county, was now hiding in a dilapidated cabin, vulnerable to his own legal and financial structure. As Silas drank the bitter tea, the feeling of recovery deepened. It was as if each sip was coating his organs with new tissue, stronger and more resilient. But along with the strength came a psychological burden. He was indebted to something he couldn't pay with a check. He was indebted to Ilara May's ancient tradition, a tradition he had publicly despised for years. The healer sat in the rocking chair near the fireplace, calmly weaving something with dark woolen threads and gazing into the fire. The atmosphere returned to one of stillness and intense observation. "When you're stronger, we'll have to work on what's festering in your memory, Silas," she said, without taking her eyes off the fire. "It's no coincidence that the bleeding started right after you refused to negotiate with the Millers over that small patch of forested land, the one with the sacred spring. You needed that land to expand your farmland by another 50 acres, an insignificant number for your empire. But for the spring, it was everything. And that land belonged, in a way you'll never understand, to something older than you or your father." Silas choked, not on his tea, but on surprise. How did she know about the Millers' negotiation? It was a tiny detail from 2 months ago, buried in a pile of business memos, a detail he had dismissed as just another obstacle to progress. "I haven't been following your progress, Silas," Elara May anticipated, sensing his unspoken question. "The problem was with you, not the paperwork. When the body is under attack, it screams at its point of origin. Where was your mind when the first spasm of pain hit you? You were signing the papers for that purchase." Silas's blood ran cold. He remembered feeling the pang, a sudden sharp burning sensation, right after he'd forced the sale of that land, knowing the Millers depended on it. He'd justified the action as a necessary business move. Now, Elara May was implying that this action had been the immediate cause of her terminal illness. The healing process wasn't merely physical, it was a forced spiritual and moral purging. Silas Croft was being forced to confront the fact that his illness wasn't a random misfortune, but the physical manifestation of his own predatory imbalance with the natural and social world. The healer wasn't just curing his body, she was dismantling the foundation of his success, piece by piece, and he could do nothing but lie down, consume his strange remedies, and listen. The cabin door creaked softly. Elara May didn't turn around. The scent of pine and earth was briefly overtaken by the aroma of cold rain and diesel fuel. "What do you need, May?" asked a deep, cautious voice. It was Sheriff Potts, the law of Red Creek County, a woman who always balanced the statute book with respect for the region's impenetrable traditions. "The same as yesterday, Clara," replied Elara May, still weaving, unhurried. "I need peace for my patient. You need your authority to keep the vultures away." Silas's heart raced. Sheriff Potts was there, a step away, and with her the chance to scream, to beg for ransom, to return to the expensive comfort of modern medicine, no matter how ineffective. But the words stuck in his throat. He remembered the cold touch of the paste on his skin and the promise that he would die if interrupted. He chose silence, the humiliation of dependence, because the promise of life, however strange, was the only thing that mattered. He closed his eyes and pretended to sleep, the millionaire farmer, playing hostage to a healer in the presence of the law, fearing that his own ransom would kill him. The reparation had begun, and it was more torturous than the disease itself. Alan Davies' return to the stone mansion nestled beneath the damp hills of Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr Wales was not a triumph, but a silent, ghostly re-entry into his own life. The luxury he had so fervently amassed, the thick Persian carpets that muffled the sound of his footsteps, the centuries-old oak beams that supported the weight of generational wealth, all now seemed tasteless, almost offensive in their solidity. Elara's cure, the healer who dwelt on the edge of the carp forest, had been extraordinary in its raw effectiveness. The poison that slowly devoured his liver and paralyzed his spirit had been eradicated with a speed that defied the modern medicine of Cardiff and London. He was alive, undeniably, but the life he felt was a pale imitation, a depleted copy of the vigor that defined Alan Davies, the most prosperous millionaire farmer in the Vale. He moved through the corridors of his house like an unwelcome guest, a spectre observing what he once possessed. His physical recovery was swift, almost unnatural. The excruciating pain that had brought him to the brink of the abyss, the kind that not even hospital morphine could completely stifle, had vanished the instant the last vapor of Elara's thick potion touched his lips. But with the pain, something else was gone. It was an emptiness, an absence that could not be filled by opulent dinners or the comforting silence of the vastness of his estate. He sat in his leather armchair, the weak Welsh morning sun filtering through the tall windows, and felt only the hollow density of time, The pendulum clock in the hall ticked the hours with an implacable cadence, and each stroke seemed to confirm that, although his heart beat, the inner engine, the voracious will that had propelled him from a humble landowner to an agribusiness magnate, had been extinguished. The absence was most noticeable in the small things. Before, Alan would spend hours inspecting his flocks of prize-winning sheep, feeling an almost physical satisfaction in touching the thick, healthy wool, in assessing the robust musculature of his breeding bulls. Now he looked out at the verdant field, stretching to where the mist kissed the hill, and saw only grass. Animals. The spark of pride, the cold calculation of profit, was gone. The money was there. A discreet check with his accountant in Swansea confirmed that all his bank accounts were intact, his investments flourishing regardless of his health. But the joy of possessing this vast fortune, the bitter pleasure of conquest, had evaporated like dew under the sun. He was a guardian of a mountain of gold that no longer warmed him. The internal conflict escalated, turning the valley's wealthiest farmer into a prisoner of his own miracle. He tried to rationalize the feeling, attributing it to the trauma of the illness, the shock of having faced death head-on and being rescued by methods bordering on medieval sorcery. But the nights brought a terrifying clarity, manifested in dreams that weren't ordinary nightmares, but vivid sensory memories of the ritual. He relived the smell of wet earth and burnt herbs, the cold pressure of Ilara's hands on his chest, and crucially, the sensation of something being extracted. It wasn't blood, it wasn't bile. It was an energy, a light that he only now realized had been the fuel for his ambition and his success. In his dreams, he saw this light emanating from him, a silvery smoke, and being carefully contained and absorbed by an amulet made of dark wood that Ilara wore around her neck. The usually discreet and reserved Llanfairpwllgwyngyllgogerychwr community watched Alan's recovery with a mixture of dread and fascination. The murmurs that had once revolved around the obscene wealth of the Davies now centered on the ancient bargain. The locals, steeped in superstitions that modernity had failed to eradicate, knew that Ilara's help was never free, and that her cures were less about bartering and more about spiritual contracts. Their fear was not of Alan, but of the shadow that followed him. When the farmhands saw him, it wasn't the pallor of his skin that frightened them, but the almost empty gleam in his eyes. He seemed to have returned from the edge, but left his soul as a deposit, and the farm began to reflect this disturbance. The grand development, the source of his fortune, began to wither. Not catastrophically, but insidiously, like a hidden disease. The cattle, which were genetically superior and won prizes at shows throughout the United Kingdom, began to exhibit inexplicable apathy. Top veterinarians, brought in hastily, could not diagnose the cause. Blood tests were normal, the feed was of impeccable quality, yet the animals lost weight, their wool became dull, their gazes vacant. It was a mirror of Alan's condition, a frightening symmetry suggesting that the life force Ilara had drained did not belong solely to him, but was intrinsically linked to the prosperity of his land. Alan, driven by a morbid need to understand the mechanism of his salvation and damnation, made his way to Ilara's small cabin in the woods. She wasn't there. The cabin was locked, shrouded in lush vegetation that seemed to have grown 3 times faster since he'd left. Only a thick mist hung in the air, transforming the scene into a Turner painting, dark and mysterious. He used a master key stored in his memory as a landowner to force open the side door of a small storage room, where Ilara kept her artifacts. The interior didn't smell of chemicals or alcohol, but rather of fresh moss, rotting wood, and strong-smelling, almost narcotic, dried spices. On the rough wooden table, Alan found a piece of parchment, more a sheet of bark than paper, on which ingredients were listed in a spiraling, almost illegible calligraphy, punctuated by runic symbols he didn't understand. He tried to decipher the list. Crow bone powder collected under the new moon, water from 7 hidden springs, black earth from the heights of Dinas Emrys, an ancient and legendary ruin, and, most disturbingly, ancient ash root fiber, harvested at the transfer point. The mention of the transfer point made bile rise in his throat, evoking the moment of detachment in his dream. There were no payment slips, only this list, a catalogue of rituals and substances belonging to a time before the centuries, a time that Elun, the pragmatist, always dismissed as a children's fairy tale. The search for Ilara, the only one who could provide the rules of this unwritten contract, became his new obsession. He sent discreet messages through his overseers, inquiring about the healer, but the answers were always evasive. "She's gone where winter takes her," one would say. "She's where she needs to be," another would reply, with a look that suggested the healer was far away but omnipresent. Alun began to feel the surveillance. It wasn't the surveillance of security cameras or the paparazzi who occasionally hunted him, but a more primal sensation, the eyes of the land. He looked out the windows of his mansion and saw dark reflections that seemed to move independently of him. The fog, Lanfere Afon's constant companion, seemed to mold itself into shapes that followed him across the property. This feeling of being trapped and unable to escape reached its peak on a particularly oppressive afternoon. Alun, in a fit of panic, decided he needed to get out, to flee those hills that now seemed like the walls of a natural prison. He grabbed the keys to his luxury Range Rover, a vehicle that represented his ability to transcend geographical limitations, and drove towards the main road leading south to the anonymous safety of urban civilization. The journey that would normally take 30 minutes to the A465 highway had become an odyssey. The weather changed with supernatural speed. The weak sun was swallowed by leaden clouds, and a fog so dense and cold descended on the road that visibility dropped to almost zero. He slowed down, the car crawling along. The fog was not normal. It smelled of peat and ancient sea air and seemed to vibrate with an unnatural silence. Suddenly, a piercing pain struck his chest, identical to the pain of the deadly illness that had consumed him months before. It was a violent pattern interrupt, a sharp warning sign. His healed body was being threatened with an instant relapse if he tried to cross the boundaries Ilara had set. He stopped the car, panting, his hands trembling on the leather steering wheel. The pain receded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving him weak and sweaty, but the message was clear. Ilara's cure came with geographical and spiritual shackles. The wealth he possessed was useless if he couldn't escape that valley. He was trapped, a ghost guarding a treasure he could no longer appreciate. The re-engagement with the reality of his servitude was brutal. Alan Davies, the man who commanded the market and dictated export prices, was now a slave to a witch from the countryside. He dragged himself back to the mansion, ignoring the curious glances of the few residents who dared to venture out into the thick fog. Upon entering, he was confronted with the image of his family in an oil portrait in the dining room, his deceased wife, his distant children in London and New York. He felt a pang of remorse, but not even the sadness was profound. It was as if the capacity to feel genuine passion, be it ambition or affection, had been the exact price of his life. This realization led him to the most devastating conclusion. The bargain didn't involve obvious material goods. It wasn't the money, for it still flowed. It wasn't the land, for it was still under his deed. What Ilara had taken was the impulse that guaranteed the maintenance and expansion of this empire. His own luck, his inherent fortune, the invisible charisma that made his businesses prosper where others failed. And the depletion of that luck was now manifesting itself in the decay of his flock and the apathy of his spirit. He had been transformed into a museum caretaker, a guardian of a wealth that was slowly draining away into the land that had held him captive. The next day, one of the farm's oldest foremen, a quiet man named Reese who had worked for the Davies since adolescence, approached Alan as he watched melancholically a group of sick sheep. Reese, who had always avoided any deep conversation, finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse with apprehension and pipe smoke. "Mr. Davies," Reese began, pulling the beret from his head. "Ilara. She's in a place we can't reach. But the debt, it remains here. It's not about what you gave, but about what you agreed to give, and it won't be satisfied until the land has its share." Alan, feeling terror solidify in his stomach, asked, his voice almost a whisper, "What does the earth want, Reese? What do I have to do to close this cycle?" Reese didn't look at him but at the distant hills where the mist danced like an omen. "The land needs balance. What you took unnaturally must be returned in equal measure. And Lord Davies, Lord Davies took much over the years. The cure was only the first payment. The rest of the debt is being calculated now." He turned away, leaving Alan alone with the threat hanging in the damp air. The miraculous cure wasn't the conclusion, but the inauguration of a new phase. A slavery disguised as salvation, where the millionaire farmer discovered that all his money couldn't buy the freedom of a contract written with magic and sealed with his own essence. And the final calculation was yet to come, promising to be far more costly than the life he had feared losing. The oppressive burning that had consumed him, a fever that seemed to burn his soul from within his ribs, had receded. It wasn't a gradual improvement, it was the violent bursting of a dam, leaving behind only cold mud and the smell of death recently averted. Silas Kincaid opened his eyes for the first time without the red haze of agony. The light streaming through the small window of Ilara's cabin was no longer a painful assault, but a soft grey, filtered through the thin layer of pine smoke that hung in the air. His lungs, just hours before suffocating stones, now expanded with surprising depth, inhaling the complex aroma of damp earth, crushed roots, and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the smell of a river that has flowed for thousands of years beneath the rock. He was alive. The mere realization was as shocking as the unbearable pain from before. He was a man who had negotiated with banks and politicians, who had amassed wealth through cold contracts and precise calculations, and now he was here, owing his existence to a woman who seemed to weave reality with dry leaves and murmured prayers. His body was weak, but his mind was, for the first time in decades, dangerously clear. It was a clarity that came with the terror of memory. The visions, the vivid nightmares Ilara had forced him to confront, those moments when he felt he was not only dying, but being judged for every piece of land he had drained, for every neighboring farmer he had crushed under the boot of his ambition. The quiet of the cabin was broken only by the crackling of embers in the wood-burning stove. Silas tried to move, but an invisible weight kept him prostrate. It was then that Ilara came into his field of vision. She didn't approach. She simply sat on the edge of a rustic stool, her hands clasped over her dark linen apron. Her eyes, which seemed to absorb all the available light, rested on him. In them, there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only the weary certainty of someone who has just completed a monumental and dirty task. "What happened?" Silas's voice was a hoarse whisper, dry as gravel. Ilara did not answer immediately. She took a nearby earthen bowl, filled it with a dark, bitter liquid that smelled of iron and moss, and raised it to his lips with a firmness that admitted no refusal. "You have been brought back," she said, her voice like a winter breeze, cold but laden with promises of spring. "But you must understand, Silas Kincaid, that I did not cure a disease. I made the earth accept you back." He swallowed the drink with difficulty. The bitterness spread through his mouth, but immediately he felt the strength course through his veins, not like a chemical shock, but like the slow resurgence of a spring. "I saw," he began, trying to process the fragments of his near-death experience. "I saw the roots and the money all rotting." Ilara nodded slowly, her head slightly tilted. "What consumed you wasn't a bacterium, Silas. It was hunger. Your hunger. You have more than any other man in this region, and yet you kept taking. You dried up not only the soil with your intensive farming methods, but the very lifeblood of the community. The living organism that is this valley began to reject the parasite. Your body was merely mirroring the sickness of your soul and the land beneath your feet." The revelation hit Silas like a lightning bolt, but he couldn't deny it. He remembered the visions, piles of banknotes turning into rotten, damp earth, the smell of sulfate and death hanging over his perfectly organized barns. "You were on the edge of the abyss," Ilara continued, rising and beginning to walk slowly around the small room, her movements silent like those of a predator in the snow. "When they brought you here, your life wasn't in physical danger. It was in cosmic danger. You no longer had a place in the cycle. I had to fight to put your name back in the Book of the Valley, and that always comes at a price." Silas, who always thought of prices in terms of digits and contractual clauses, felt a chill run down his spine. He had billions. He could give her the entire farm if necessary. "Money, I'll give you whatever you want, 20 times what this cabin is worth, what your time is worth." Ilara stopped, spun on her heels and looked at him with an expression of icy pity that was more painful than the fever. "You still don't understand anything, Silas Kincaid. You're offering me the same currency that almost killed you, the same disease. If I accepted your money, I would become part of your cycle of extraction, and you would go back to being the man you were, the man the earth tried to spit out." She approached the fireplace and picked up a piece of charred wood, tracing a quick, intricate symbol on the cold hearthstone before turning to face him. The climax was approaching, not with screams or explosions, but with the terrifying stillness of an inevitable sentence. "The price of your life is not measured in gold or silver. It is measured in sacrifice, in reparation, and in balance." Silas swallowed hard. "What do I have to give up?" "Your foundation, the root of your illness and the proof of your dominion," Ilara declared. "You know which is the oldest piece of land you own, the one you bought 40 years ago and never managed to cultivate. Whispering Hill. Whispering Hill." The name sent an electric shock through him. It was a sacred piece of land, a small, dense, ancient forest on the northern edge of his holdings. He'd bought it in a shady deal, ignoring the protests of the local elders, who said it was an ancient burial ground, a place where the line between the world of the living and the dead was too thin. Silas wanted it only to complete the map of his empire, a piece of sovereignty he intended one day to transform into an exclusive golf course, a final insult to the wilderness. "No," he whispered, his throat tightening. That piece of land was the symbol of his absolute power, the only place on his map that couldn't be commercialized without losing its aura of untouchability. "Yes," Ilara retorted, her voice growing in authority. "You cede Whispering Hill, not to me, not to sell, but to the valley. You must sign a deed, a writ of cinder and soil, transferring custodianship of this site to the Ashe County Community Protection Committee with the irrevocable stipulation that it will never be cultivated, sold, built upon, or exploited. It must remain as it is, a sanctuary for roots and memory." Silas felt his bile rising. It was a betrayal, not of the community, which he barely considered, but of himself, of the Silas Kincaid who had spent his entire life accumulating, never giving back. This was the ultimate test, the complete reversal of his existential purpose. "This is unacceptable," he managed to say, though the weakness in his body screamed otherwise. "I fought for this land, and he almost died because of it. Or do you think it was a coincidence that his illness peaked when you were signing the contract to cut down the last centennial trees in that place? The valley tried to kill you to protect itself," Ilara explained, her voice now a deep echo of mountains and streams. "You can have your life back, Silas, but you must prove that you will no longer use it to suffocate. You must give back what you stole from the quietude." The inner conflict was a physical pain, sharper than any previous fever. On one side, the ghost of the ruthless tycoon screamed about precedents, lost profits, and the weakness of succumbing to superstition. On the other, the vivid memory of darkness, of the mud, and the feeling that his soul was being disintegrated into dust. Life suddenly had a value that money could never buy. "And what if I refuse?" he asked, the last vestige of defiance. Ilara stared at him intently, without blinking. "You're already cured of the poison. I've cleared the path, but the road will only remain open if you keep your word. If you refuse, you'll revert to who you were, and next time there will be no turning back. The cycle will close and take you away forever." Silas understood. He wasn't being threatened with death. He was being threatened with his old life. And that old life, he now knew with cold certainty, was death in installments. He took a deep breath, drawing in the scent of herbs and earth. "The Whispering Hill," he repeated, the name sounding strange, almost sacred on his lips. "It will be written." As soon as the words were spoken, the weight that oppressed him in bed seemed to decrease by 10 kilos. It wasn't relief, it was lightness, the feeling that a debt had been acknowledged, even if not paid. Ilara smiled, a small old smile that didn't reach her eyes. She turned to a shelf hidden behind a cloth and pulled out a thick brownish parchment, along with a raven feather fountain pen and an inkwell that seemed to contain soot mixed with dew. "Sign here," she instructed, unrolling the parchment onto a piece of polished wood. The document, handwritten in an elaborate medieval script, made no mention of monetary values, only the transfer of eternal custody and the restriction of non-intervention by humans. It was the writ of cinder and soil. Silas struggled to sit up. His hand trembled. He picked up the pen. The ink smelled of cold smoke. The act of signing was not merely a legal act, it was a ritual of divestment. He was dismantling the empire that had taken him 50 years to build. He was signing not just a document, but a new identity. With concentrated effort, he wrote his name, Silas Kincaid. The pen scraped against the parchment with a dry, definite sound. When the ink dried, Ilara picked up the document and rolled it up again, sealing it with a red wax seal that she melted with a piece of glowing twig from the fireplace. "It's done. The cycle has rebalanced," she declared. "You are free, Silas Kincaid. Free to live if you know how." The following days were a mixture of convalescence and profound reorientation. Silas refused to be transferred to a hospital or to his barren mansion. He remained in Ilara's hut for another week, drinking the bitter infusions, eating only boiled vegetables and rye bread, and listening to the silence. Ilara taught him about the patience of the earth, about the difference between harvesting and plundering. She spoke little of herself, but much about the responsibility of those blessed with abundance. When he was finally strong enough to leave, the first thing he did was go to the lawyer. The writ of cinder and soil was a shock to the office. They had never seen such an archaic and restrictive legal instrument. But under the threat of a newly resurrected Silas Kincaid, who displayed a dangerous calm and a new inflexibility, the paperwork was processed. Whispering Hill was officially returned to the community's custody to be preserved as a sacred conservation area. The impact on the small town of Ravens Creek was immediate and seismic. Silas Kincaid, the man who devoured land and lives, had relinquished his most coveted prize. Neighbors spoke of a miracle, some of fear. No one knew exactly what had happened in that cabin, but the evidence was undeniable. The millionaire farmer was different. He was still Silas Kincaid, the richest man in the county, but the cruel rigidity had melted away, replaced by a restrained seriousness. The story's conclusion wasn't a sugar-coated tale of complete redemption. Silas didn't become a saint. He continued to manage his vast empire, but his methods changed. He invested heavily in sustainable agricultural practices, not out of philanthropy, but because Ilara had convinced him that the disease was merely nature's warning against unsustainable greed. His tractors were still the largest, but now he left stretches of forest untouched, and the streams on his land ran free of pesticides. What was most remarkable was his relationship with the community. Silas began to pay fairly. He funded the local hospital that he had criticized for years. He spoke to the small farmers with a respect he had never shown before, understanding that true wealth lay not in individual accumulation, but in the health of the ecosystem around them. As for Ilara, the healer, she disappeared from public attention as quickly as she had appeared to save the tycoon. She never accepted money from Silas, refusing any material gifts. He tried to visit her a few times, bringing baskets of fruit and bread, but the cabin was always locked. The last time Silas saw her was years later, during a heavy winter snowstorm near the edge of the newly protected Whispering Hill. He was inspecting the boundary of his land, now more of a guardian than an owner. She was there, wrapped in a heavy shawl, gathering something from the ice, her slender silhouette indistinct against the dark pine forest. Silas stopped his truck. He got out, feeling the cold, clean air on his face, the same air that had choked him years ago. "Ilara!" he called. She turned her head. She said nothing, but her eyes met his. The look was one of recognition, but also of infinite distance. It was the gaze of someone who saw the truth beyond the flesh. Silas hesitated. What could he say? Thank you. He owed her more than his life. I kept my word. The land is fine. I am fine. Ilara gave a slow, deliberate nod. She then pointed to the ancient forest, Whispering Hill. She didn't point with her finger, but with her whole arm, a gesture that encompassed all the mist and dark trees. "You don't have to pay anything more, Silas." Her voice reached him, surprisingly strong in the cold air. "The cost has been paid, but remember, life is a gift that demands service. Now that you know the difference between having and living, don't waste it again." With that, she turned and walked into the forest. In 2 steps, the blizzard engulfed her. Silas waited, but she did not reappear. He returned home, an older and perhaps more solitary man, but undeniably alive. The mystery of Ilara and the miracle of her salvation became the silent legend of Raven's Creek, a constant reminder that, even in a world ruled by money, there are transactions that can only be sealed with soul and earth. The living proof of the healer's power was not the sealed scroll, nor Silas Kincaid's restored health, but Whispering Hill itself, which remained there, black, silent, and eternally untouched, awaiting final judgment. Silas Kincaid's story ended not with a period, but with an eternal comma of vigilance. He had bought his life back, but the price was the constant maintenance of balance. And with each sunset over the Appalachian Mountains, he felt the healer's gaze upon him, ensuring that the cycle, now restored, would never be broken again. If this extraordinary story of salvation and sacrifice touches your own perception of what it truly means to have wealth and the cost of life, ask yourself, what is your own right of cinder and soil? What piece of your sovereignty would you need to relinquish to be truly free and healed?